So let's get to our speaker this morning. With a PhD in cardiovascular physiology, Dr. Kaia spent 20 years working in scientific research in both academic and business environments. Before coming into Faith Search staff, her country girl passion led her to a nonprofit Christian mentoring program which uses horses to help touch the hearts of disadvantaged and at-risk youth. She enjoys her life on the farm in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, with her husband, Todd. Where's Todd at? Hello, Todd. And their two kids, Taylor and Jake. Do you know what they're doing right now?
They're all grown. I've got 3 grandbabies.
Okay, and 3 grandkids. She's also an author, writing in a children's book series called Faith Lessons from a Colored Box Farm. A gifted woman, an educated woman, a PhD. She's going to share with us today, exploring the evidence for you, God in a mud puddle, making sense of creation, evolution. Let's give a warm welcome, Dr. Kaia Kloster.
Well, thank you very much for having me and for coming out this bright and early Saturday morning. My name is Kaia, and gosh, I have so much that I want to share with you guys. So I hope that we can get through what I brought. But mostly, I just pray that you will leave here with a new idea of how you might look and balance faith and reason. I know we live in a culture where it's really a struggle to go through school and learn what the scientist teachers are telling and all that, and turn on the History Channel and watch the Discovery Channel, and you just get really inundated with this wealth of scientific information that seems to counter what we learn in the Bible and at church. I maybe would just share just a brief story about part of my background. My dad was a biology teacher, and my mom was a nurse. Both were raised in Christian homes, but my dad, not getting some of the answers that he needed as he struggled with his faith, ended up falling away from the Christian faith. And, growing up in that home with obviously a scientific bent myself, it was kind of interesting, and I had to wrestle through some of those questions and figure things out for myself. My dad, I can remember a specific story. Joe shared I love horses. And I can remember in about 8th grade, and I'm spraying fly spray on my horse. And the stuff that was the best stuff the year before was just spraying the flies, and they weren't dying at all. And my dad explained to me, well, that's because, the flies have evolved. And the ones that were resistant to that, chemical have survived and populated, and now we have a resistant population. And it sounded so brilliant, and it is, and that's how it works. And then I'm going to flash forward, as a scientist, I went to some meetings in Washington, D.C., and my mom traveled with me, and we visited the National History Museum. And I remember looking at the skulls they have lined up from, the cavemen all the way up to modern man. And I remember just thinking, and I said to my mom, Mom, what do I do with this? Like, how do I resolve what I read about creation and what they're proving, it seems, out here in the scientific world where I live? And my mom said to me, you just have to have faith, Kaia. And I love my mom, but that wasn't the answer I needed to hear. And we have a lot of kids and a lot of people, probably maybe in this room, that are struggling with how do I balance those things. And so I hope this morning we can talk about some of those things and how you don't just have to have blind faith. That's what Faith Search is all about, is proclaiming the gospel with evidence. So I'm not going to tell you what to think, but how to think. And not what to believe, but why you can believe it. We got to just do some background work here. We got to look at what bias is. We have to talk a little bit about the different kinds of science. Let's just visit really quickly the scientific method. I know not everybody is a scientist. And then what in the world is the real evidence? Let's take a look at some of that. So what does get in the way of our objectivity? If you look at the definition of bias, I'm going to just focus mostly on the second there. In science, we talk about a systematic error that can be introduced into testing when you come in with a preformed opinion, basically. I would say you can use bias as a more general definition of it's that filter of pre-existing knowledge and observations through which all your new information is interpreted. Everything that you've seen and heard and experienced shapes how you see the world. What we can't do is change the evidence. We all have the same evidence. When we look at the Grand Canyon, when we look at various life forms, one might come in with their bias, their worldview, and look at the evidence and come out with a conclusion. Another person might come in with their worldview, look at the very same evidence and come up with a different answer. What we do know is that when we look out in the world, there's a lot of life forms. There's a lot from simple to complex, plant life, aquatic, vertebrate. So who is biased? And quite honestly, this is Donald Johanson. He's the discoverer of Lucy, a paleoanthropologist. And he admits in his book, there is no such thing as a total lack of bias. I have it, everybody has it. So really, we just have to acknowledge we're looking through a lens. Everybody has the glasses they're looking through, and everybody might have a little bit different worldview. I think sometimes many of us just receive our worldview from the family we're raised in, and we may just accept that and just never really wrestle it or consider anything different. Sometimes people do wrestle. They do consider different vantage points. And quite honestly, sometimes people just get their glasses on a little too tight. So, and you know, I think a lot of times as Christians, we're criticized of that. You just believe in the Bible and you're never going to be able to see evidence clearly, you know. And there's truth to that. I know some Christians that don't believe dinosaurs existed because they don't think they see them in the Bible, which we could have another talk on that. But, so they have this narrow viewpoint. But I will tell you that it's the same for scientists, and I can say this as a scientist. This quote comes from Colin Patterson. He was the senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, and he is secular, an evolutionist, does not believe biblically, but his quote points out what bias can do. He basically says that in pre-Darwinian biology, it was carried about by people who believed in God, and it shaped the way they did their science. Well, today, post-Darwinian biology is being carried out by people whose faith is in almost the deity of Darwin, the God of Darwin. They've seen their task as to elaborate his theory and to fill the gaps in it, to fill the trunk and the twigs of the tree. But it seems to me that the theoretical framework has very little impact on the actual progress of biological research. In fact, in a way, some aspects of Darwinism and of neo-Darwinism seem to me to have held back the progress of science. And this is, I'll just give a quick example. So I was in medical research for 20 years. I had the opportunity to work with a really exciting technology. This was a photochemical crosslinker. The schematic up there represents two ring structures with a carbon chain. And when it got zapped with blue light, the rings would get blown off, and that carbon chain now has reactive sites on each end. And you could put two pieces of tissue together and end up bonding to one and to the other, and it was like a glue, a photochemical glue. So we did all kinds of testing, different variations, and in good science you have control groups as well. So we also had some that got neither the light or the compound, some got just the compound, some got just the light, and all the time, just the one that got the light and the compound bonded tissues. So one summer we had a college student that was interning with us. And she started turning in results where they were seeing bonding in one of the control groups. And I remember thinking, what is she doing wrong? Because that's not how it happens. My bias said that we can't have bonding if we don't have light and compound. Well, we came to find out that one of the tweaks we had made it so that it was bonding in the absence of the light. And that was a wonderful discovery because now we could use this in places where it's hard to deliver light to. And so we could have missed a really important discovery if our bias had not allowed us to see what was actually happening in our results. This is from pretty recent times here, 2005. They have actually discovered soft tissue in dinosaur bones. Have you heard this? They have actually found microstructures that look like blood vessels, like red blood cells, like connective tissue. And who would ever expect to find that in millions of year old bones? So this was reported in the Smithsonian magazine in 2006, and the article is called Dinosaur Shocker. And it talks about how this finding just amazed colleagues who had never imagined that even a trace of still soft dinosaur tissue could survive. The reason it hadn't been discovered before is that no right-thinking paleontologist would do what Mary did with her specimens. They didn't expect to find it, so they never looked. In fact, inside the dinosaur vessels are things that the author describes as round microstructures. Well, if you've seen a red blood cell, they kind of are donut-shaped with the pale center. They carry heme for blood transport or for oxygen transport. And they had all those things but she didn't call them red blood cells because that seemed too fantastical to imagine that there could be red blood cells in a dinosaur bone that was millions of years old, right? And so you can see now how bias influences. So what I'm asking you today is whatever background you come in with, I'm just asking that you slide your glasses down a little bit and look over and try to be as objective as possible at the information that I'm going to share. Because when we fail to recognize bias and to observe evidence objectively, we can miss important discoveries, and most importantly, we fail to discover truth. So now, a quick look at different kinds of science. This was eye-opening for me. The kind of science I did was operational science. So we could do it in the present time. I would write up my methods and my results, and it would go into a journal somewhere across the country. A lab could redo those experiments and see if I was credible, right? That type of scientific approach has really advanced scientific knowledge. We have computers, we've sent people to the moon, we've got cures for cancer. So it's really gained great credibility with the public. Now, origin science, what you have to remember, that uses data from the past. We can't go back and reproduce the beginning of time as much as we would like to. You can't repeat experiments and have different labs verify it. So instead, we use science to develop theories about origins, but it's borrowed its credibility from the kind of science that I did. So when a scientist reports that we've proven this, it's believed because of the credibility that operational science has brought. But I just want to have you, again, remain open-minded to how we can interpret data. So the scientific method, let's say we have two premises. So we have the creation and the evolution ideas. One has about 6,000 years, one has about 20 million, and that changes often. I'm not even sure where it's at right now. One has God, who is a creator, and the other we have molecules and random, assembly of structure and organization and function. One thing I like to point out is a question I get all the time is, okay, well then who created God? And honestly, if you believe in evolution, you have the same struggle. Who created matter? Where did it come from? So either something has come from nothing, or something has always existed. So as crazy as it might be to believe in an eternal God that has always existed, quite honestly, that's just a universal problem. So what we do with origin science is we look at something in the world, actual evidence, we form a hypothesis on what we think is going on, and then we can do different observations and experiments to test against that theory. And the way it works is on the right side, if those results continue to contradict, it eventually loses credibility, and then you reject or modify that theory and come back and start again. So it's still a scientific process. On the left-hand side, if the results support the hypothesis, it's going to gain credibility, and it will be accepted ultimately as valid. I also want to remind you, great minds, historical scientists have often come up with ideas that end up not being right. Aristotle believed that the brain cooled the body. And now we laugh at that concept, but that was believed for years. Scientists and leading academicians told a trusting world the world was flat, and so they just thought that must be so. Well, we know now that that's not true. And so this idea that Darwin proposed all species originated from an original source of life and evolved with small gradual changes over millions of years, is that really true? And that's going to be the premise of our discussion this morning. So Darwin proposes a tree of life, and I'm going to ask you, does it maybe look more like a lawn or an orchard? There's different ways to look at that same evidence. A lot of times people believe that if you're a creationist, you believe that a certain creature was created and has continued to exist in that form since the beginning of time. So there's no change over time. Some species may die out, so you see those blades of grass that are shorter, and some exist still to this day. So that would be a lawn. Now we can look, Darwin, saw that finches changed to have different beaks and things like that. And so those mosquitoes I told you about, those populations changed. So we watch things change, so this does fall under valid scientific criticism. The reason Darwin's idea really even had a foothold was because before his time, in the 1830s, for many, many years, the scientific world believed in catastrophism. They believed the Bible. They believed that a flood changed the world at one point. And that's what kind of led their science discovery. But in about the 1830s, there was geologists that were talking about this idea that maybe things have always been this way. Maybe there's just been gradual, uniform processes that result in these layering that we see as we look like in canyons and things, or as we dig down for archaeological discoveries. In that mindset now, in that academic mindset, Darwin made his observations and he said, all right, well then what if we have millions of years, what if various types of animals and plants have their origins in pre-existing types and they change through successive generations back in 1859. So this is a familiar tree of life, right? That we start with this spark of life and over millions of years you diversify into all the living forms we see today. I call this evolution with a big E. This is a really important distinction. It's the theory of evolution, and it goes back, it's really molecules to man. So what Darwinism said was that this could be accounted for by processes of natural selection. What happens, I'm going to show you, actually this is not sufficient to get the new genetic information that we need to diversify and have more and more complex organisms. And so they came up with what they call neo-Darwinism. And in this scenario, we also include mutations. And we're going to talk about both those points. So first of all, you need to know that natural selection happens based on genetic variability that already exists within the coding, the DNA coding for that organism. It does result in survival of the fittest. We do, like those mosquitoes, the fittest ones were the ones that had some resistance to that fly spray, and they survived. So it is survival of the fittest. But the changes are limited to the genetic information within that mosquito. And so, for example, we don't end up with green horses because that genetic information just simply isn't there. And what I'm going to show you is that natural selection actually results in the loss of genetic information. Now, Joe started with the mud puddle and then like the single cell, and it evolved into this ape-like and then man-like creature. You'd have to get a lot of information to move from a one-celled organism to us with arms and legs and hearts and eyes and brains, right? Again, I'm asking you to slide your glasses down. If you have historically, or you typically look at the world with evolutionary glasses, that's presented a lot in our culture. So I'm going to ask you, let's take a look at that same evidence from a biblical perspective. In the Bible, it talks about a great flood, and that the ark that carried 2 of each kind of animal came to rest in Mount Ararat, somewhere in the range of Mount Ararat. And if we think about the Arctic Circle as being the coldest on the planet and the equator being the warmest, isn't it interesting that it really is almost equidistant? It's just kind of right smack dab in the middle. And if you read in the Bible, it talks about how God would send 2 of every kind. And don't you believe if there's a creator brilliant enough to create all of this, that he would know what 2 animals to send? If the ark is going to land here, you might want a medium length fur dog. Now, if you've had genetics, obviously coding for fur length is not this simple, but it's a basic premise that there is information for both long and short hair in each dog. If they marry and have kids, as Ken Ham would say, this is borrowed from Answers in Genesis, then the offspring could either get a short from each parent and have short hair. They could get a long gene from one and a short gene from the other and have medium fur. Or they could get a long-haired gene from each parent and be long-haired. So when you have that kind of genotype, it's the most diverse. There's a lot of genetic diversity there, and you can create a lot of different offspring. Now, if a pack of dogs starts, filling the region and they start spreading out their territories, some are going north, some are going south. If these dogs start to move north, it's going to get really cold. What is going to happen to the pups that have short hair? They'll be too cold. And way up north, even medium fur is not going to cut it. So pretty soon, you're going to have long-haired dogs up there. So they marry and have kids, and what do you have? They all have long hair. So is that more or less genetic diversity? Less. You've lost information. You'd have to introduce hybrid vigor and bring back some short-haired dogs to get that information back into the populations. So actually, it's a loss of information, and you still have dogs. You're not any closer to any other kind of organism. You still just have dogs. So if you get off the ark and you've got 2 ancestral archetypes of the dog kind, then from that, over time, you could create the coyote, the wolf, the dog, the jackal. Does that make sense? And a lot of people might say, but there's no way there's enough time. If we don't have millions of years, if we're limited to 6,000 years, like you're saying, then we don't have enough time to get as much genetic diversity as we see. And I would beg to differ, because look what we've done to dogs in about a couple hundred years. Under the right conditions, you can have a lot of selection going on. And so you can have tons of genetic diversity in a short time. So what I believe is that we have more of the true creationist orchard model, where, yes, God created kinds. There would have been a dog kind and a cat kind and a horse kind. But it doesn't mean that that same kind is what we see in our world today. That over time, those kinds would have evolved with a small e to fit different niches in our world, to be zebras and donkeys and mules in the horse kind, to be panthers and bobcats and lynx in the cat kind. And so I believe this is more what we see. And so actually, what does the evidence hold up? In fact, even again, in secular publications, it talks about how really they're discovering that evolution itself had its own big bang. Like all of a sudden, there was just fully formed and functional organisms that just appear on the landscape in almost a geological instant. It says new discoveries show that life as we know it began in an amazing biological frenzy that changed the planet almost overnight. So not millions of years. And this isn't creationists talking, this is scientists. The fossil record reports that if life on Earth corresponded to a 24-hour period, then the Cambrian explosion would have occurred just in 2 minutes out of the entire day, almost a geological instant. So again, if we're going to get from a simple-celled organism to a complex human, for example, there's 2,000 proteins in bacteria. There's like 100,000 proteins in humans. So we have to have a mechanism to get new genetic information. And what we found is that natural selection actually results in the loss of information. How would we ever accumulate all the genetic information that makes us human if we started as a simple-celled organism? So then scientists, realizing that shortcoming of the theory, said, well, okay, but maybe there's mutations. Mutations might introduce new information. Well, actually, mutations are very rare, and they're nearly always harmful. Even the ones that are beneficial result in a loss of information. We're going to look at that too. And actually, no mutation has ever resulted in new information. So again, jumping into some heavy science here, if you have a bacteria that is killed by a certain antibiotic, that's the native genotype, is the gene expressed, the type of gene expressed. Then in the mutation, you have a bacteria, but it doesn't have, do you see that little receptor? This kind of bacteria that's mutated no longer is making that receptor. So in your native one, if you bring in an antibiotic, it seats on the receptor and it starts this cell signaling. So from that, it's like a key almost, and it starts this whole process. And this information goes into the cell, and then the cell ends up dying. So, and honestly, like as a physiologist, some people study science and fall away from the faith. As I studied science and looked at how crazy, complex, and amazing, and the cell signaling alone would say there cannot just be random chance involved here. But now if you have a bacteria, you put the antibiotic in, but there's no receptor. And so if there's no receptor, there's no effect. So which cells are going to populate? Which bacteria are going to live? The mutated ones. So all of a sudden now you have a whole population of bacteria that are no longer susceptible to the antibiotics your doctor's been giving you. So that is what's happening. Here's another example. This is a different kind of antibiotic. It's delivered as a prodrug, so it's like kind of 2 units that are fused. It's delivered as a prodrug, and inside that bacteria on the left, you see that it's to denote an enzyme that cleaves those 2 components apart, and now you have a cytoactive drug that kills the bacteria. So again, in the mutated genotype, no longer able to make the enzyme. So now we put the antibiotic in, no enzyme, no effect. So they live, they populate. Now we have a population of bacteria that are no longer susceptible to that kind of antibiotic. But now in each of these cases, have you gained information? No, you've lost it. You've lost information. And there's still bacteria. Okay, so here, right, we've got extra stuff. So this is definitely a mutation. There's something wrong. It's not normal. But is it really new information? No, we already had the genetic information to make legs. We just have too many. So there's nothing new, and it's still a frog. So one other aspect of the evolutionary theory that I just think is grossly lacking, honestly, is this idea of how do we evolve slowly over millions of years when each organism has to live and be able to pass on whatever new information it got. That's incomprehensible to me as a scientist to think about how does that happen. A lot of popular theory right now is that dinosaurs didn't go extinct, they now are birds, right? Maybe you've heard that. And if you look at a reptile lung, they breathe in, and the air exchange goes on in the alveolar sacs, and then they breathe out. In the avian lung, the air comes in and it goes along in a linear fashion. And in that middle, like capillary, the parabronchi, that's where the air exchange happens. So imagine now how you're going to move over millions of years and many with small successive changes and get to a fully functional living organism that has a whole different kind of lung. This is a theory in crisis. It talks about really a lot of the shortcomings in the evolutionary theory. Michael Denton, he says just how such an utterly different respiratory system could have evolved gradually from the standard vertebrate design is fantastically difficult to envisage, especially bearing in mind that the maintenance of respiratory function is absolutely vital to the life of an organism, to the extent that the slightest malfunction leads to death within minutes. The avian lung brings us very close to answering Darwin's challenge. Darwin himself said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. He also said in Origins of Species, I think it's interesting because I feel like nobody really goes back and reads that original work, right? I mean, not very many. They just watch public television and hear millions of years and get fed this idea of that it's proven that we've evolved. But Charles Darwin himself said, surely if evolution happened, innumerable transitional forms must have existed, but why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? Why is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology surely does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the greatest objection which can be urged against my theory. So having laid the scientific framework, now, because we have our biblical lens on, we're trying this out, what does the Bible say? In 2 Peter, I find it amazing that thousands of years before this evolutionary concept was evolved, and this idea of uniformitarianism, Peter writes, first of all, you must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, where is this coming he promised? Ever since our fathers died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation. But they deliberately forget that long ago, by God's word, the heavens existed, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. And by these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. Isn't it kind of crazy? I mean, it's not crazy. If there's a God that created the universe that always was and always will be and knows everything, he knew someday people are going to go into this uniformitarianism thing. I better put in there, they're going to someday believe that it always has been the way it's always been. And they're going to forget that there was a flood. And isn't that exactly what science has done with their glasses on tight? But quoting scripture, I want to assure you too, what happens when we start to undermine authority, when we lose sight of who we are created in the image of God, we also lose sight of the promises. And God's word also says, but God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, so that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God didn't send his son into the world to condemn it, but to save it through Jesus. And so that is where I'm going to leave you for the first mini talk. Just with this idea of natural selection and mutations and evolution in that sense. So when we come back, you can discuss these amongst yourselves as we take a little break, get some coffee, whatever. And then we're going to take a look at the evidence that they have for the evolution of humans.